While many conspiracy theories are short lived, there are some that never seem to die, no matter how much contrary evidence is furnished. We have all heard of the Holocaust deniers, or those who consider climate change to be a hoax, or those who insist that moon landings were fake. Another such theory is that of the Great Replacement, that is centered around an elite conspiracy to replace the white population of America with non whites. While the term itself may be new, the ideas behind this theory have persisted for a long time. In the highly influential book, The Passing of the Great Race, published in 1916 by Madison Grant, he called whites as an endangered species. The 2020 US Census report came as a confirmation for many ardents of this theory. It revealed that people who identify as white alone declined for the first time since the census began in 1790. Yet more disturbingly for them, majority of Americans under 18 are now people of color. Anxieties about the future of the white race are expressed repeatedly by politicians and popular show hosts, and are further amplified by social media. The Great Replacement theory has been linked to several mass shootings over the last decade. We at Argumentative Indians would like to understand what drives this theory, what makes it so alluring, and why has it proved to be so resilient? And finally, is there any truth to it? To address this, we have with us Dr. Richard Alba, Distinguished Professor at City University of New York. He's known for developing assimilation theory to fit the contemporary multiracial era of immigration, with studies in America, France, and Germany. He's the author of The Great Demographic Illusion, Majority, Minority, and the Expanding American Mainstream. So welcome to Argumentative Indians.
Well, thank you very much. And you've set up a kind of interesting and stimulating set of issues at the outset. So let me make a few remarks about how I see the changes that are taking place in the United States in relationship to the Great Replacement theory. So it's worth bearing in mind that the Great Replacement theory in its contemporary formulation didn't arise in the United States. It arose in France. Its author was a man named Renaud Camus, who is a French intellectual politician. He, as far as I know, is not a relative of the wonderful Albert Camus, who has given us such a rich literature on cultural contact and tolerance. And so it was Camus who asserted for the West in general that elites were seeking to replace whites with people of color whom they saw as more controllable. And of course, his ideas were not really only restricted to North America, but had very much bearing on Europe as well. Now, you cited the famous work of Madison Grant from 1916. Madison Grant, of course, wrote well before Mr. Camus. And so what this tells us, as you've hinted at, is that these ideas have been around for a while. And the United States, in fact, went through a similar period of great anxiety at a moment of a high level of immigration early in the 20th century, when some intellectuals and elites actually believed that the white race was in peril. But by white, they meant actually not what we think of as white today, but they meant sort of Protestant Anglo-Saxons. In other words, people who were Protestant and came from Northern and Western Europe were under threat from the great immigration in the United States occurring at that time from Southern and Eastern Europe, including many Eastern European Jews and many Southern Italians, groups that stood out and were seen as inferior. In a sense, that replacement happened, but no one cared when it did. And when I say it happened, what I mean is that indeed, the population of Protestants from Northern and Western Europe has greatly shrunk in the United States. But no one has really thought about this as a major issue. Why? Because the peoples that they saw as so different in the early 20th century became in the mid 20th century no longer so different, but really part of the us, part of the American mainstream. So I think, the enormous flaw in the Great Replacement theory is to see the differences between immigrants and natives as somehow unchanging over time, whereas in fact, they change as people have contact with one another through a variety of social processes that I'm happy to talk about in some detail in the United States. Your citing of the US Census, though, raises this issue. So yes, it's true that many Americans see the current census as showing a decline in the white population. I believe it does not show that. But what it does reveal is, again, that the people that we see as so different are becoming gradually a part of us. How is that happening? Well, one way that it's happening is that many descendants of immigrants from places that are not white and many native whites are forming families. And they are having children, mixed children, children who are partly Black and partly white, partly Hispanic and partly white, partly Asian and partly white. So when we say things like, well, the population that is white alone has contracted, that leaves out the children of these other whites who are in mixed family settings. If we say, well, they're at least partly white, why don't we see what the white population looks like if we count them as white also, instead of counting them as minority? Then the white population did not decline. So in effect, we're faced with a definitional question. How should we think about these boundary spanning children who grow up in families where they have many white relatives and many non-white relatives? I don't think actually it's fair to call them white, but it is fair to say that they are very integrated with whites. And we see that through any number of indicators, including, incidentally, that they themselves have high rates of marriage to people who are only white. In effect, then, what we're seeing is the formation of a new mainstream in the United States. The mainstream expansion in the middle of the 20th century included people who were religiously and ethnically different from native white Protestants, but not racially different. The new mainstream expansion is now including people who are racially distinct from whites, but who are no longer seen as very different from them. And so I think, if we think about the long span of human history, whether it's in India or in Europe or in the United States, what that long span includes is human migration and contact between peoples who were once seen as different because some were migrants and some had been settled in a place for a much longer period. Sometimes those migrations, of course, yield to bloody confrontations. That's much less true in the contemporary world. But many times in human history, what happens is that the peoples eventually merge, and the distinctions between them, even though they may be historically recognized, they become relatively minor in terms of their everyday meaning. And I think, that is, thank heavens, the huge flaw in the Great Replacement idea. So I'm happy to now, start a discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for that opening there. So you mentioned that this thing started in France, and there it seems like it's still part of the mainstream. We had recently in the presidential candidate in France, Eric Zemmour, actually say that like his agenda is he said something like his agenda was to try to save France from the Great Replacement. And when they talk about Great Replacement, it's generally, you're absolutely right about the mixed race children and everything, but generally it's targeted very much towards immigration, where the people who are coming, they are culturally distinct and they are also racially distinct often. And at the same time, and the fears seem to be that if we allow a large scale migration, interestingly, the word they use is on immigrants, they often use the word invaders. And it's nothing new. I mean, to me, this kind of vocabulary has been part of the discourse for a very long time. As you mentioned, like earlier Italians were the outsiders and these kind of words were used for them. And then for the Jews, we know for Chinese migrants in the 1800s, the Japanese in the early 1900s. So I wanted to ask you, specifically in the case of United States, do you think that this has something to do with the subconscious awareness among the white or that the European settlers had actually replaced the native people of America, and that subconscious awareness that this is what had happened, the migrants came and became the invaders, leads to these fears towards any new wave of migrants that these people might just do what the European settlers did to the native people of America?
Well, I mean, first, let me say that that's a very, very, very clever observation. But I don't think that. And the reason I say that is that what we see is that these anxieties are arising they're not just in the United States, they're also in Europe. And where, I mean, in France, I don't think that one could easily contrive an idea like that, that the French who've been settled since the Middle Ages in France think somehow that they replaced a prior people through genocide, as whites did with respect to Native Americans. No, I think that this kind of xenophobia is really a product of social change, and that people see that the world around them is changing in ways that they have not anticipated, that the world that they knew and that they esteem highly, let's say, of their childhood or their youth, is really changing and cannot be retrieved. And they think that somehow they can go backwards in time by expelling, the new groups. I think it's really an anxiety of social change, and we are going through changes in many parts of the world because of globalization and the ease of movement of people across borders. Not that the immigration to the United States, by the way, is so staggering in its magnitude. So in the earlier eras of mass migration from Europe, including the era of mass migration from Southern and Eastern Europe, there were some decades in which the new immigrants amounted to 10% of the US population. It's a really sort of a staggering number. And today, over a decade, they amount to no more than about 3% of the American population. So it's a much kind of more modest migration. Granted, if in the United States, we're a racially diverse country. We have been racially diverse since our founding, not just because of Native Americans, but also because of the forced importation of Africans due to slavery. And so the US actually is, in terms of its diversity, which is immense, really, is much further along in terms of population change, let us say, than are many of the countries in Europe, where really, the Muslim immigrants and their descendants are a very modest sized part of the population. So you cited the figure about the decline of whites, and I actually don't really believe that minorities outnumber whites in the youth population either. And again, the problem is that the census, and for reasons that we can go into, decided 2 decades ago to count anyone of mixed racial or mixed ethnic ancestry as non-white. And that meant that a sizable part of the children of whites are being assigned to the minority category. And that's the reason it appears that among children, that minorities outnumber whites. When you take into account the large fraction of mixed children in the child population, it really looks more like whites and minorities are balanced in number, and there's a sizable group of mixed white and minority children as well. Yeah.
So we mentioned like that these anxieties have always been there, and you said any kind of social change leads to this kind of anxiety. That's understandable, but this current form of replacement theory that we are talking about, which is currently and which I think there is different versions, and some the Jews are the sort of main orchestrators and some the liberal Democrats are the main orchestrators. But what do you think, which form do you think poses the biggest danger because people find it to be most believable and are likely to act upon it?
Yeah, well, I think that one always has to bring into play here the role of politics, because these ideas may be floating around, but they crystallize when politicians are able to take advantage of them. I mean, the former Yugoslavia offers a horrible example in the sense that this was a country that was, yes, very diverse ethnically, religiously, but there was a lot of intermarriage when it was a unitary country, Yugoslavia. But as it broke up and politicians, like Serb politicians, began to take advantage of the anxieties that were present in the population about mixing, they were able to drive a kind of ethno-nationalism that had very lethal consequences, as we know. And I think that currently in the United States, there are many right-wing politicians that are willing to exploit these anxieties for political gain, with, of course, the example of President Trump first and foremost. And I think that he has given so these politicians give a kind of white nationalism, which is a broader term, I think, than the adherence to the Great Replacement theory. They give white nationalism a kind of credibility, a legitimacy that it didn't previously have. And so there is a danger. I think the grave danger in the United States is actually more to our democratic system than it is to the immigrants themselves. The United States is in real need of immigration, as are many of the countries in Europe. And the United States has a very robust economy, and really the native population is really not sufficient to supply all the workers, and not just low wage workers, but some very elite workers too, like the workers in Silicon Valley. So we need immigrants really to help keep a robust economy. And I think it's true in many of the European countries as well. I mean, France, I don't know about the exact demography of France at the moment, but many of the Northern European countries and now the Southern European countries have had sustained low fertility. There are very relatively few young people in relation to older people. So to kind of preserve a robust economy, as well as to provide services to an older population, immigration is really needed. So there's really no way that these countries could do without immigrants. And so that creates a social change that feeds into these anxieties.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have expressed they would be open to immigration. It's just the kind of immigrants they want, right? A lot of people would
Well,
like to have European immigrants coming into the US,
well, good
but
luck, good luck. And as you may remember, I mean, since you are very well informed about the US, President Trump expressed the desire for Norwegian immigrants. Now, that is totally laughable. Norway is a tiny country. You know, that's 5 million people. How many immigrants could Norway potentially send to the US? I mean, it's not possible. Both Europe and the United States are in need of immigrants. So, I mean, the world is changing. Yeah.
but then in terms of the anxiety, right? Like you said, there's two things going on at play here. So we need migrants. Majority of the migrants are going to come from different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, and also there is a difference in fertility rates for now between the migrants. I mean, it's less and less so with Asian migrants, but with other migrant groups, there is remarkable fertility rates are different between the white population and the migrants, which caused anxiety that eventually that non-white groups might become the majority. But what is the fear there? Is the fear
But
that
but
the
when the
majority
non-white
can
groups become the majority, many of them won't be seen so strongly as non-whites. They will be seen simply as Americans. Just, I
exactly?
mean, the great fear a century ago was that white Protestants would be overrun by Catholics. This brings back the theme of religion, but also the theme of fertility, because the Catholics were seen as, following the precepts of the church, having much greater fertility than white Protestants, so that they would outbreed, as it were, the northern and western ancestry natives of the U.S. But so two things happened. One is over time, and actually fairly quickly, the fertility of the Catholics went way down
Mm.
and became approximate to the fertility of the white Protestants. And the second is that the distinction between the felt distinction of they're really different from us, that distinction greatly diminished. And so that, marriages between Protestants and Catholics just became very common. And so I think this is, I'm, well, let me express it as a hope. I think this could happen again. And I think, if past at all predicts future, then it will happen again.
I let's talk about that in a minute. I do want to discuss this, how this could play out actually. But before that, I just wanted to understand like the fear. If we all believe that United States is an equal society, it's a democracy, everyone has equal opportunity and there's justice is equal for all, then it should not make you nervous or afraid that your group might become a minority. You're afraid only when you have a belief that right now, being a majority, you have certain privileges that are endangered once you're no longer the majority, once you are no longer controlling the political power. There is risks for you to lose your privilege.
No, I
So my
agree. I agree with you. And I'm sure that's part of the fear, is the fear. So whites in the United States, of course, they know they're the dominant group. I mean, who's been president aside from Barack Obama? Thank you. And so they fear, and I don't think it's so much a fear for themselves. It's a fear for the world that their children and grandchildren will inherit, in which they think that once non-whites, defined however, appear to be a majority, that they will be able to, they will assume the seats of power, and they will then use the power on behalf of those who are like themselves. Absolutely, I think that's at the root of the fear. I agree.
That's what makes it the more laughable, the fear, because there is no such thing when you say non-whites. There is no such thing as non-whites. It's not a cohesive group which is going to agree on anything. Where even if they were to become a majority, there is not much in common between people from Latin America and South Korea, or between India and China. I mean, they have
No,
very
I
different.
actually, I totally agree with you.
It's
But nevertheless, these are not rational fears.
yes.
And And moreover, we already see, and this is an aspect of the assimilation that's ongoing for the, especially for the descendants of immigrants, is that from a political point of view, a sizable share of the immigrant populations and their descendants are moving toward the Republican Party. And that's a particularly noticeable trend among Hispanics. And that's important because Hispanics are deemed to be, and this there are some problems in this counting, but I won't get into them, but are deemed to be such a large population that they are the largest minority. And yet now we see that they are not, as people thought 2 decades ago, all voting loyally for the Democrats. And that's going to, I mean, those movements are going to continue. That's a natural part, it seems to me, of the ongoing assimilation that is really quite strong among parts of the Latino population.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot that they, like a lot of the migrant groups actually have a lot more in terms of social and cultural preferences in common with the older white Americans, I would say, especially when it comes to social
Yeah,
conservatism.
absolutely.
When it
Absolutely.
comes to, for example, openness to same-sex marriage, a lot of the
Well,
migrant
there
groups.
definitely some of the, the Latinos have a very strong, it's also true of African Americans, actually, that there are parts of these groups that have very conservative, religiously inspired orientations towards sexual behavior and other kinds of, behavior that is viewed as morally suspect, or at least is subject to morality, drug use, criminality, sexuality. Yeah. No, you're completely right. And moreover, I mean, what this whole anxiety leaves out is that even if whites are the numerical minority, they may not be the political minority. And that's true because they are older, and the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. They are citizens, and some of the the people who are being counted in the people of color category are not citizens. And disproportionately the people of color are among children who don't vote. So when you look at the percentage of whites in the effective electorate, it's higher by a good margin than the percentage of whites counted by the US Census. So in 2020, 72% of the electorate was white, even though the 2020 census, as you pointed out, counted something like 57% of the population as white. So there's a big discrepancy between the demography and political power. And that's going to last for a while.
But even when it doesn't last, let's say the apocalyptic year of 2045, by these estimates, when whites will no longer be the majority, even if we get there, right? So there are some who think of that as something that would bring an end to white supremacy and racism in America. America would be able to move forward. But it sounds like to me that you would probably not agree with those people, because you think that the concept of white is going to adapt and is going to expand and accommodate new and new people, and
Well, I
then
think
those
that is
people,
true. Yes, that
once
is.
they acquire the status of being white, just as you mentioned, like Italians and Irish did back in the day, then these people are going to look down towards the next wave of people coming in, or who are still not there at the white status.
I
So
think here's one idea I want to plant, though. I think it won't be necessary to become white for people of color to be seen as not very different from whites, just as it was not necessary for Catholics to become Protestants to be seen as actually pretty similar, really, to Protestants. And I think this process is, I mean, if we look at people of prominence in the United States, what do we see? Whether we look at politics, whether we look at the world of music or the world of other arts, more and more diversity is very visible. And that tells us that the perception, of, oh, this is somebody like me is really changing, I think. I mean, this was also a part of the changes, that took place in the mid-century, is the culture, the popular culture, for example, changed very dramatically in the 2 decades following World War II, which is when this mass assimilation happened, as more and more people from the new immigrant groups were incorporated into the popular culture and seen as idols or as people that could be emulated. Think Frank Sinatra as the perfect example of this. Well, the same is happening today for the newer groups. So the perception of difference is changing.
But if I were
But
to
it is
take a
true, by the way, just let me make one point. It is true that the people of color category includes many people, especially among Latinos, who can be seen as white
yes,
already. They already are racially white. And so they can rather easily then assimilate. I mean, it's to have your, let's say your name is Brian Sanchez. So the Sanchez indicates that you're of Latino descent. The Brian part, however, indicates that your parents gave you an American
trying to
sounding
assimilate.
name. So that's just, how are they different really from, somebody like myself who has an Italian name, Alba, and okay, and the Richard indicates that, my parents named me to sound like an American. I think.
But that's not a very optimistic scenario, because in that case, and I think we're already seeing some of that play, that even among Latinos, you'll start seeing the ones who have less pigment in their skin start to look at their other Latinos in a different way. In fact, in the same family, you could see the skin pigmentation
Oh,
differences
I think,
starting to
but I mean,
create.
I'm not trying to be optimistic or pessimistic. I'm trying to describe what I believe are the ongoing processes of assimilation that is changing the mainstream society in a way that
Yes,
falsifies the Great Replacement. And so, if you say that, well, some of the Latinos can easily blend into the white population, it implies that the way whites are being counted is way too narrow. And the whole Great Replacement concept of, well, 2045, that people of color are going to be a majority, it's simply not true.
right. But so I agree with you. But what I'm trying to say is that, so some of the things that you said, right? Certain groups, even though they look different, they are from different racial backgrounds. People have started realizing that they are quite similar because they have fairly similar lifestyles, they have their achievements, and there is more acceptability. Like you said, there is more acceptability now in politics. Kamala Harris becomes the vice president. We have a lot of representation in films and television. But I'm just trying to like take account of view that, is this really because we are becoming more open as a people to like are we becoming more open to diversity, or we are saying that, okay, as long as these people are like me, I'm willing to accept them and bring them into the fold, and because there's always another set of people out there who are the others. So I'll give you one in a just anecdote where I was told by somebody in New Orleans that, oh, we Indians are actually good, they're hardworking. Obviously Indians are a selective group in the US, they're all coming through high skill programs, but
No, of course, no, yeah,
his view is that Indians are do well and they're hardworking and they are people who care about family values, as opposed to Latinos who are all criminals. That was, and he said this blatantly racist thing to me on my face,
yeah.
thinking that I would probably agree to some level or whatever. And this
May
is
I
what I
answer?
also play,
Yeah.
just once again, this is something that I'm starting to see also play out among the people who are now accepted into the fold. So like a lot of Indian Americans who've done really well and are treated really well, they have somehow, a lot of them seem to have acquired the same kind of stereotypes towards Black people or Latin people that the white people have. So there is again that sort of hierarchy now playing out.
None of what I've said implies that processes of social exclusion based on race are going to disappear. So I totally agree with what you've said. And really the same things happened during the middle of the 20th century when, the excluded white ethnics became a part of American society. One of the things that's was very noticeable is that many of them became conservatives. And indeed, if we look at the ranks of conservatives today, their presence, like the Rudy Giuliani's, is extremely noticeable.
Yes.
I'm trying to describe something that is ongoing. I don't want to render it in rosy terms that say, oh, well, this is going to be the end of any racism in the United States. We're far from that.
Right. So the replacement theory will probably persist. It's just that who's getting replaced, that definition of that group is going to expand, and who is replacing that, the definition of that group is going to change with time. Like it used to be
I
the
think that could
Irish,
well
and
be. Yes. And indeed, that's our history, right? Because as you cited, Madison Grant. So in the early 20th century, and Madison Grant, by the way, was extremely anti-Semitic. So he was very wary of the potential power of Jews in the United States. So, then it was the Jews and the Italians and the Catholics in general from Southern and Eastern Europe. And today it's, people coming from poor countries in Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa that are the greatest target of this animosity. Yes, it changes over time, but it doesn't mean that we are therefore ending. The fact that there's going to be more diversity is in and of itself a good thing, but it does not spell the end of racism by any stretch of the
right,
imagination.
and probably won't even end the replacement theory. But
Maybe
like you have a
not.
point,
Maybe
it will
not.
not. It will not. There will be no great replacement, but this theory will continue and it will keep
Well,
adapting to times.
there'll be xenophobia. That is to say, the fear
Correct.
of people who are different because of their foreign origin. Yeah.
But you mentioned Jews and the anti-Semitism that was there prominent in the early 20th century. But even till date, some versions of the theory kind of put it on the Jews to be behind this conspiracy
Yes.
to
Yes.
replace the
Absolutely.
white
Yes.
population. That I'm really curious about that. Why? I mean, what possible interest could Jews have in bringing more Africans or Asians or Latinos into America?
Well, they have none. I mean, no, they have none. And it is an interesting question. I don't have a good answer for why Jews in particular are
It's just fun to
selected.
blame
Well,
them
they're
for
seen
everything.
as, I think part of it is that these stereotypically they're seen as very powerful.
Right.
And certainly they're very prominent in American society, in the leadership and in positions in many institutional areas. But yeah, of course, there are other kinds of conspiracy theories that target other groups. So I happen to be particularly sensitive to Italians. So they were seen as, as controlling and, a widespread criminal conspiracy that, had infiltrated many areas of American life and sucked out, wealth on a very large scale. And I
The
mean,
mafia.
the mafia, right? And that really persisted. I think finally, the ideas about the mafia are starting to really, I won't say disappear, but at least to become quiet. But that really lasted into the early 21st century. Think of the Sopranos, the series that was so popular, and I think it's, obviously there were Italians in organized crime, but the power and the wealth that were attributed to this group were greatly exaggerated from the reality of what it was like, which was much more kind of, for many of these men, much more mundane.
So in case of Italians, there was also, like you said, there was a religious element to it.
Yes.
Before that, the dominant group were the Protestants, and then these Catholics started showing up, and there were these anxieties of your culture getting diluted or being overwhelmed by people who of a different religion who had a very high fertility rate. And now when we are seeing the migrations, a lot of the migrants tend not to be Christian at all. They are Hindus, Muslims, and and a lot of them are atheists, I guess, from East Asian countries. So what, like, how do you see those religious spheres play out in this, in the existing version of the replacement theory?
Yeah,
Like,
I think that
people excited in America would no longer remain like a Christian nation. I mean, it's officially it's a secular nation, but a lot of people tend to see it as a Christian nation.
many people on the right see it as a Christian nation.
Yes.
They want to sort of make that status official in some way, to give it a kind of a legal authority that it doesn't currently have, that clearly conflicts with the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Yeah, I think that the religious aspect is less in the US than it is in Europe. And yes, in Europe, the dividing line is really religion more than anything else. That's not true in the US. I think in the US, the dividing line is much more seen in racial terms than it is in religious terms. And, I know very few Americans know anything about Hinduism or the other religions, for example, that come with the Indian immigration. And I think it's also true that we have to be careful not to exaggerate the degree to which the immigrants from Asia are non-Christian. There are many Christians among them.
Yeah,
Christians are overrepresented in the immigration relative to their shares of the populations of the countries from which they're coming, and others become Christian in the US because it's convenient. For example, religious bodies, like among the Koreans, religious groups are a way of preserving ethnic community for the immigrants. And so membership in a Korean Christian church can be very important for many Korean immigrants.
Right. Yeah, but there is, we have seen out a lot of Islamophobic speech and actions play out in the US. You're absolutely right. It's much more pronounced in Europe. But we have seen attacks also in US and Canada.
Oh, yes. No, of course. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I understand.
But I think the
But I
numbers
think that's really because, I mean, in the United States, I think 9/11 really fed tremendously into that, because it seemed to establish a kind of militant Islam as an enemy of the United States. And so, and that it's, and therefore, Muslims as people to fear who might harbor terrorist tendencies. Yeah.
Right. And let me now come to another interesting phenomenon that will play out. So according to the US Census report, I mean, we've talked about that the under 18s, they think already reached majority non-white status, and you nuanced that by saying some of them are mixed race. But then according to the report, by 2027, the same thing is going to happen to the category between 18 and 29 years old. And then a few years later that, and by the time they reach 2045, every majority is going to be non-white. So interestingly, there is this recognition that, like, in the younger categories in the US, increasingly there will be more and more non-whites, whereas the older category is going to remain white for very long. And you've yourself mentioned that because they tend to vote more, they'll be able to control political power for much longer than currently is now understood.
Yes, yeah.
But I'm interested in terms of, like, America's culture wars are always discussed not only in the US but all over the world. They seem to get a lot of attention, and there is a big intergenerational divide playing out, whether it comes to issues like transgender or whether it comes to things like environment. There is a big intergenerational angle as well playing out. It's obviously there's a rural urban angle, but there's also an intergenerational angle between the baby boomers and the millennials and the Gen Z. So now, but now it's not just going to be intergenerational in the same race, but there is going to be a racial difference between the generations. So I wonder how that might actually play out. Does it exaggerate the differences between the older generations and the younger generations, because they're no longer the same race?
I think it probably does feed into the intergenerational conflicts. And I think that something that's very noticeable to people on the left is that the younger progressives are much more demanding about rapid anti-racist change than older generations. And apparently, this is playing out in conflicts in progressive groups in the United States. So, the older generation believes that change should be a little more incremental and maybe not lead to the total displacement of whites. And the younger generation is demanding really very fast paced change. So yes, I think there is that definitely there's that element. And of course, the older Americans are more conservative. There's no question about that.
I mean, older people everywhere are, but it's just that
Yeah.
in the US, I think, I mean, perhaps, I don't know, it's the education or stuff which encourages you to challenge, to question, and to not abide, as opposed to many of the other cultures where conformity is encouraged.
Yes. Well,
In the
that's
US,
right.
there is this that results in in the younger people willing to kind of like be much more vocal about what they see as right and what they see as wrong. And we see that play out on campuses where they refuse to allow people who have a different opinion to be honored by being
Yes.
coming in.
Right.
So we are
That's right.
seeing a lot of this play out, and that is why a lot of people think that like even the parties themselves, Republican Party, is being stretched, pushed to one side by the really conservative, and the Democrats are being pushed to the extremes by the very liberal, and these are predominantly younger people. Whereas on the Republican side,
Yeah.
it's
No,
predominantly older.
I mean, I think the idea of political polarization in the United States is very real and is very difficult. And of course, I'm an older person, right? So maybe this is just my conservatism speaking, but I think it is a real problem for our democracy, and that to me, in the political sphere, to bring about change is going to require the Democrats to reach more deeply into the white population. It's very clear that the current political alignment of the Democrats is not sufficient, may win elections, but it doesn't win elections with a sufficient margin for the Democrats to truly govern and to bring about helpful change in the United States. So I think this is a real problem.
And they haven't really been able to even counter this, what we're just talking about, the great replacement theory. I mean, there is all sorts of discussions that, oh, this is a conspiracy theory, it's a myth, we've busted the myth, there is evidence, this, all of that has been around, but it continues to be part. I've not seen anybody officially address it. The term itself is probably not used among the circles who ascribe to it, but it's in some form or another, it seems to be alluded everywhere that there is some sort of danger, threat looming.
Okay, so now you're really coming to my subject. So the Great Demographic Illusion, the book that you cited, is about how the United States has been sort of Americans are being misled by demographic data that are sort of poorly configured and poorly interpreted. And so I think that the census itself has contributed, unfortunately, in a major way to sort of these anxieties about replacement, because it itself divides the world in binary terms. So you're a white or you are non-white in census data. I think that's a big mistake, and that it is a falsification of the social realities in the United States and the changes that are ongoing, for example, through mixed ancestry. And a better understanding would give us, for many whites, a more hopeful view of how the future is going to play out.
Do you think there should be that question at all about the race? I mean, it's not just on the census in the
really
US.
Good question.
It's
It's a very
everywhere,
good question.
for the educational institutions, for the job. Literally, that question is literally everywhere. They're always trying to count the people in the racial terms. And it's very different from, let's say, France, where they try to be blind to it. So my question is like, is that so important to constantly remind people and make them be so conscious about their race?
Well, I mean, it's a vexed question, and I don't have the perfect answer to it. Um, I so one of my colleagues, Kenneth Pruitt, a political scientist who was in fact the director of the Census Bureau at the time when the census allowed people for finally to indicate that they were of more than one racial background. He believes that the race question should be eventually, not immediately, but eventually removed from the decennial census that is asked of everyone in the United States. And he argues that it has led to an exaggerated attention to race as a basis of inequality, as opposed to class as a basis of inequality, because the census doesn't have any question that would allow you to measure somebody's class of either origin or current class. I think that there is a justification for the race question on the census today. It is, of course, if you look at the constitutional stipulation of the census, it does include race. So you could argue there's a constitutional basis for asking about race. But I think there's also a moral political basis for asking about race, and it's because historically race has been the basis of oppression of Native Americans, as you pointed out, of African Americans, and that historical oppression is still relevant. That is to say, it is still visible in contemporary inequalities, and the only way we can hope to rectify that is to continue to measure the differences among these groups. But I do agree that in the contemporary world, it's taken on an importance that does seem unhealthy, that it is everything, and that the way we think about our society is wrong, in my view, wrong. I mean, it's divided into two parts: whites versus non-whites. As you pointed out, the non-whites are a completely heterogeneous group of people. I mean, it doesn't make sense to think of them as a kind of single population in these terms. But it's also that there's something more now in the middle, and that middle part is growing, and it will continue to grow as more and more people form families across these major racial divisions. So we need a better way to think about how the population is divided.
Yeah, do you think like we should make the definition of white more flexible, or you think we should bifurcate the racial groups into many different categories? I'll tell you from my example, right? I I just don't understand, because they try to forge an identity that I don't ordinarily have, but because every time I have to feel that I'm not a white, not a black, and not a Hispanic, then I'm in the fourth group, whatever that may include, and that includes a Korean and me, who normally don't share any identity. But because of feeling that if I were to live in the US, at some point I think I might start thinking that we are the fourth group and we are the fourth identity. It's forging a new
Well, I mean,
identity.
so what is happening in part is, again, I mean, you have to think about how the world of politics intrudes here. And so Indians are a tiny part of the American population. And so for some people who either come from Asia or have parents who came from Asia, the category of Asian American somehow makes sense, because that has more political weight than does a category like Korean or Indian. And therefore, there are political entrepreneurs, who seek to sort of make the category of Asian American meaningful so that it will attract more people and form a community within which political discussion can take place. I mean, that's already quite visible.
Interesting. So they are deliberately forging a new identity,
Yes.
including several groups, to make it large enough so it can have a political weight.
Yes, I think
That's
that's correct. And for example, there is routine collection of data about, quote, Asian Americans. You can find surveys, that about Asian Americans, and they will tell you, this Indians think this, Chinese think this, and Japanese think that, but nevertheless, the overall umbrella term is seen as sufficiently meaningful that one can have a survey dedicated to the collection of these groups, even though, as you point out, they are very different.
I mean,
And
it's okay as a Indian or a Chinese, I think, but I assume we dominate the to such an extent that a poor Cambodian or a Burmese or Vietnamese would not get any visibility at all, and they're quite different as well. But they probably and they don't have the same privileges as we have in the U.S. context.
Well, all of these categories, by the way, turn out to be problematic when you think about the details. So, for example, the category of Hispanics contains people from Spain. Well, wait a second. Aren't people from Spain just like people from Italy? I mean, aren't they part of the European descent population? And then, there are groups like the Argentinians who are overwhelmingly the descendants of immigrants who came in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to Argentina from Spain and Italy. So why are they not the same as, the descendants of Italians who came to the United States at the same time? So there are a lot of problematics whenever we take any of these big categories and look at the details. The details are messy.
Right. Well, look, Dr. Alba, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a real pleasure conversing with you, and it's been very enlightening to get your insights on this matter. It's as you said, it's not a US only thing. It plays out in different forms. We talked about Europe, but it's actually something quite true in India as well.
Of course, yes, yeah.
Going forward, and I think by understanding the dynamics of these kind of social forces in other countries, we are able to understand ours better. Also, once you have a outside perspective, then it becomes easier to analyze what's going on around us, because then we can look at it as an outsider. Otherwise, we're too caught up inside it. So thank you so much for enlightening us, and we hope to have you with us again in future.
Well, it's been an honor. I enjoyed the conversation very much, and I have to say I'm extremely impressed with your knowledge of the United States. And I think you were able to lead me in a very kind of informed and instructive conversation. So I wish you well, and I hope whatever audience we have, I hope that they learned something as well as enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Bye.